tonight. Mary is a world-renowned cyber psychologist, an absolutely fascinating perspective on the way attackers think. Was the role model for the character in CSI Cyber. Has published multiple works on this, and absolutely incredibly interesting person to talk to. If you have the chance to speak with Mary at the party or around the conference, I would highly recommend it. With that, Sean, do you want to? You gotta come get me. You gotta give me the hug. So Sean and I did a. Oh, okay, wait, come on. All right.
Cheers. Okay. Good morning. So my name is Mary. I'm a cyber psychologist. And today I'm going to be talking to you, or this morning I'm going to be talking to you about the cyber psychology human factor in hybrid identity. So thanks, Alex, for the introduction. We had a very nice meal last night with some of the other guys. And thank you to Sempris for inviting me to speak here today. It's really, really important to factor the human into the hybrid identity equation. I'm a cyber psychologist. Cyber psychology is a relatively new discipline. It's about 25 years old, and it's an advanced discipline within applied psychology. My specialist area is forensic cyber psychology, which is the study of criminal, legal, and cybersecurity aspects. And in terms of the criminal piece, I'm kept pretty busy. I work frontline as an advisor to Europol. I work with Interpol. Nothing good ever happens in my day. So effectively, I remain very optimistic about solutions because I can see where the behavior is going and, importantly, where the solutions might lie. In terms of what we're doing here today, we're here today in the real world, in the room together. When we go online, it's not just transactional. What we're doing is entering into a powerful psychological environment, the environment of cyberspace. In 2016, NATO actually formally ratified cyberspace as an environment, acknowledging that the battles of the future would take place on land, sea, air, and on computer networks. And unfortunately, how right they were. And my go-to conceptualization of cyberspace is the US military joint protocols, which conceptualizes cyberspace as having three layers. Here you have the physical or network layer, the first layer. The second layer is the logical layer. And the third layer is the cyber persona layer. That's us, the humans. And the physical network layer is the connectivity in a physical context of cables, of servers afforded in cyberspace. The next layer is the communication afforded by that physical infrastructure. And then you have us, the humans, the users, and the operators. And then you have your complete range of threat actors that you're all familiar with in this space. Now, we've had 50 or 60 years of cybersecurity, and yet the issues are getting worse. Cybersecurity protects your data, your systems, and your devices. But it does not protect what it is to be human online. And therein lies the problem. So if we look at these first two layers, they're very well served by cybersecurity. And for me, the missing link is the broad umbrella area of cyber safety, or what we specifically describe as safety tech, which I'll get to later. And ultimately, it is the combination of cybersecurity and cyber safety that effectively will deliver 360 resilience. So let's talk about humans in cyberspace. What we see is powerful psychological drivers. So people, as cyber psychologists, we argue that people's behavior can fundamentally mutate or change in cyber context. And it's really important to recognize these changes in behavior. So let's look at a couple of examples. So you have the power of anonymity online. So think of dark web, think of Tor, think of anonymizing capabilities. And the point about anonymity is that it is actually the ancient superpower of invisibility. Think back to mythology, the cloak of invisibility. But that power comes with great responsibility. And the question is, as humans, can we actually take on that responsibility? Personally, I would fundamentally question the premise of anonymity online or the capacity to have that. I've debated with the American Civil Liberties Union on this topic, and they state that anonymity online is a fundamental human right. No, it is not. It is a 25-year-old invention of the net and one that must be questioned. And yes, in oppressed regimes, we want people to be able to blog or vlog or tweet or whatever, but at what cost? And if that cost is rampant cybercriminality, then arguably the cost is too much. So the question is, there can't be any sacred cows in cyber contexts. We have to question everything. Then you have online disinhibition, the work of Suler, 2004, which dictates that people will do things online that they will not do in the real world. And I think we've all seen examples of that in terms of, hey, it might be a great idea to post this pic. Well, maybe not. And if we think about these factors, we start to begin to conceptualize a profile of how human behavior changes. Then you have online syndication. I first wrote about this in my book, The Cyber Effect, which was published in 2016. And, it's been published worldwide. In fact, I'm on my third edition in China. The book was also published in Russia. So my little tech book, crossed the Great Firewall of China, and it points to the importance of this as a global conversation. And in online syndication, I call it the mathematics of criminal or abnormal behavior online. So here's the thing. I'm a sex offender in the north of the country, and you're a sex offender. I don't mean you. In the south of the country. What was the probability of us coming into contact with each other? Very hard in a real world context, and that comes at great personal risk. However, within 2 clicks, we can syndicate to find each other in cyber contexts. My prediction is, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, is that is going to drive the incidence of deviant, criminal, abnormal, and threat actor behaviors in cyber contexts, this ability to syndicate. And I'll talk about some specific examples of that. And then you have traits. You have impulsivity, you have compulsivity, you have addictive type behaviors. In 2 contexts, you have the psychological environment, but you've also got a timeline, a developmental timeline of kids that are being born and being raised online, all the way through to juvenile cyber delinquency, in terms of cyber feral youth, in terms of young people getting locked into echo chambers, in terms of excessive gaming, and the social isolation that can come with that in real world context. So we've got to factor that in a sort of a longitudinal way. So if we think about online disinhibition specific to hybrid identity, and if we look at, say, the attack vectors, when we look at these traits and states, they're not just specific to the user, they also apply to threat actors and to cybercriminal entities. So attacker behavior might be more aggressive in cyber context because they're anonymous and they're disinhibited. User behavior, you've got carelessness around digital exhaust, which helps attackers build that cyber behavioral profile. You might have oversharing of data, careless clicking, risk-taking and reduced caution in cyber contexts. So how do you counter that? Well, in your training, in education and awareness protocols, you may factor those in terms of, simulated phishing or training exercises. Although I think increasingly employees are getting a little fed up with being treated like lab rats and being socially engineered by their own company. So I think that those training and education exercises have to be deployed with caution. So in terms of hybrid identity, what's the cyber-psychological battlefield? You've got attackers weaponizing psychological vulnerabilities. You've got users taking shortcuts and engaging in risk-taking. So therefore, in order to defend systems, we need to build psychologically resilient systems that are trustworthy, that are transparent, and that have low friction. In short, we need human-aware defenses. I describe this as mind over machine. And the premise that identity is as much psychological as it is technical. So what does that mean? We know that any hybrid identity environments will succeed or fail on how security is deployed, on the infrastructure. But they will also succeed or fail on how people trust, perceive, interact, and comply. And that is the Achilles heel. That is what we need to focus on. So threat actors know this as well. The point is that 90-odd% of cyber attacks come as a result of socially engineered attacks. Social engineering has everything to do with psychology and very little to do with technology. And that's why when you are building out your cyber defense teams and thinking about how you're going to secure your systems, there is a role for cyber behavioral scientists at the table to do this important role of getting that human perspective embedded in solutions. I'm head of the Department of Cyberpsychology at Capital Tech University in Washington, D.C. It's one of the leading STEM universities. We launched our doctoral programs in cyberpsychology and forensic cyberpsychology 2.5 years ago. At the moment, I have 65 students doing PhDs in these subjects. And many of my students are mature and already have a PhD already. And many of them have their doctorate in engineering or computer science, and they're crossing over to the light side. So let's have a look at what's happening. We have AI-driven phishing attacks happening in real time. And effectively, cybercriminals, threat actors, are adopting dark AI and using that to augment attack vectors. I want you to think of, if we think about this in terms of a period in time. So we started off with human-on-human attacks. You had good old-fashioned threat actors, and you had, good old-fashioned cybercriminals, and then you had humans on the other end of that attack. Now what we're seeing is cybercriminal enterprise moving towards AI-facilitated attacks. And importantly, deploying cyber behavioral science and automating that in their attacks. So what does that mean for, for the enterprise? Effectively, it means something with the power and velocity, the fire hose of GPT being pointed at the humans in your organization. Now, the question is, can humans withstand that form of attack vector? Probably not. So we're going to need to augment our human defenses with AI defenses, but not AI machine defenses, AI defenses that enable appropriate behavioral responses. I think of it as a sort of an agentic AI angel sitting on the shoulder of the user or the operator and helping them to withstand these attack vectors. So AI is changing the psychology of attacks. What we also see, and specifically in this environment, is MFA fatigue. And this happens because humans can become overloaded. We see, what was it, Alex described it as last night, MFA bombing. And eventually people just give up and go, okay, all I want to do is just get in, and I'm just going to agree. So therefore, when we're conceptualizing defense, we need to think about cognitive load and security fatigue and factor that into MFA procedures. In other words, trust and fatigue will be the new battlegrounds in this area. Then we have the adaptive authentication. How do we design systems that are fair, transparent, low friction, and increase compliance? And this really taps into organizational psychology. I think if the IT division of a company had their way, there would be no humans in the system. If sales had their way, there would be no IT compliance because it's seen as a barrier to the sales teams doing their jobs and marketing. So you've always got that organizational tension that you have to address. And effectively, what we need to think about is how the cyber behavioral sciences can offer solutions, how we can address these cyber psychological triggers that form the basis of these attack vectors in terms of urgency, authority, fear, our cognitive biases, our heuristics, our decision-making, our judgment, the thing that makes us human. Also the thing that makes us a higher order species. So the future is building psychologically resilient systems. And success means that systems are built that people can trust, that they understand and accept culturally, not just technically. There's no point in saying we have the most brilliant technical solution if people don't want to use it or will not comply with it. And effectively, next-gen identity systems must counter learned helplessness. So what is learned helplessness? It comes from the work of Seligman, a famous psychologist back in the day. And any IT help desk operator could define what learned helplessness is in terms of that constant hopelessness. And again, there's a tension there between constantly helping people out to the point that they become hopeless and helpless and depressed and diminished, or actually physically empowering them. The other area that we need to be cognizant of is monitoring anxiety. And effectively, that's a basic human fear of excessive surveillance. And this needs to be factored into the design of any robust identity verification system. These are the human factors that you need to account for. So let's have a quick look at the cyber behavioral attack vectors. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the slide deck is going to be available after the fact so you can browse. So first of all, you've got the exploitation of cognitive shortcuts. I'll give you one example, which is called a heuristic. So what's a heuristic? A heuristic is a shortcut. It's a rule of thumb that humans use to make a decision. So, for example, when you were packing your bag to come here to South Carolina, you probably glanced briefly at the weather, or you might have had a heuristic of it's going to be warmer there than it is where I am now. And therefore, I'm going to put in some light shirts. And Charleston, South Carolina is a relatively small place, and I'm going to probably wear some good walking shoes. Now, you don't need to write lists and research that. You just have a rule of thumb of I'm packing to go somewhere warm where I can walk. And that's how you make your decisions. So you have, in terms of an attack vector, a thing called the authority heuristic. And that's when an attacker impersonates somebody in charge, your boss, your division head, somebody who asks you to do something. And the propensity as a human is to respond. We saw this in a deep fake attack. You're probably familiar with it. I believe it was an unfortunate bank employee in Hong Kong where there was a deep fake conference call. And 2 psychological levers were actually executed, apart from the technological execution, which was the deep fakes. What you had was the authority heuristic, where the CEO, CFO, CISO were all on the call, telling this poor, unfortunate employee to actually transfer a very large amount of money. And the deepfakes were excellent, but there were 4 or 5 entities on that call. There was only one human, and the one human was the target. So the second psychological premise that was leveraged there was theories of conformity. So if you're a group of 5 people, and this is well established in tests where you can have 5 people, say this table here, and you can show them 2 lines, and one line is clearly shorter than the other. And if you're at a group and everybody in the group says, no, the shorter line is the same length, ultimately people will feel a propensity to agree. And that's conformity bias. So these are innate human decision-making cognitive biases. And these are what are being exploited by cyber attackers. And therefore, these are the things that we need to build into our defense systems. We're not just defending machines, we're defending human minds. If we look at exploiting cognitive biases, one of my favorite, and especially for this group that I'm speaking to today, is the overconfidence bias. No offense, guys and girls. I.e., it will not happen to me. Well, it just might. And that is as critical an attack vector as somebody who is not technologically literate. And what we see, if we take incidences of, say, for example, cyber fraud and general population, you can have the 2 most attack groups in terms of cyber fraud are young people aged 18 to 25, most of whom have superb tech skills, and seniors, many of whom may not have superb tech skills. And both of these groups are targeted, but for different reasons. The younger cohort, because they're careless with their data, because they will jump to any website to get $10 off a pair of sneakers. And the senior group, because they're very careful with their data, but they don't have the same technological literacy and therefore have vulnerability. So different groups, different attack vectors, different reasons. You can have a look at all the different cognitive biases, and all of this work is referenced at the end of the slide deck. So another attack vector is exploiting decision-making under pressure. This is one that'll be familiar to this group: stress and fatigue, cognitive overload, end of day, high workload, and these attacks happening when somebody is physically exhausted. And there is protective merit in terms of not overworking, not overloading employees, particularly in the tech sector. So let's come back to cyber safety. So I'm one of the founders of the what's called the online safety technology sector. It started about 10 years ago in the UK when the Online Harm Bill was being introduced, which became the Online Safety Bill. And I remember dealing with some government representatives at the time, and they said, you know, we need to develop a whole new sector so we can financially motivate and incentivize people to develop technology solutions to technology-facilitated, problematic, harmful, and indeed criminal behavior. So fantastic. So we did the research, we created a taxonomy, you can see the history of all the reports, and we looked at delivering solutions at a platform level, network level, device or endpoint level in the information environment, and created this body of research. We had a symposium where they were going to, something like this, a large group, it was an online group, and they were going to launch the sector. And they said, we're going to call it the online safety technology sector. So I said, no, in the pre-meeting. I said, that's never going to fly. You know, it's a mouthful. Naming a sector is part art, part science. We have reg tech, we have fintech, we have edutech. You know, this should be called safety tech. And they said, no, Mary, no, we want to call it the online safety technology sector. I said, okay. So we went into the online symposium and there were about 40 or 50 people on the call. And for 2 hours, I used the shorthand safety tech every time I was making a point or every time we were discussing it. And by the end of the meeting, I had everybody on the call talking about safety tech. So afterward, the government official said, okay, Mary, you got your way. I said, I'm a behavioral scientist. That was never... I was always going to get my way. And you know, somebody once said to me, you can't know you're right about something. I said, but I am. And they said, no, it's something that's going to happen in the future. You cannot sit here and say that you are right. I said, I can. It's math. Well, how is it math? Well, if 99 times out of 100 I'm right, then the probability is I'm right now. Sometimes you have to get your way. So we have all these reports. We now have the International State of Safety Tech report, which is coming out in 2025. And we're broadening our taxonomy to actually include agentic AI and evolutions in that regard, and cyber-physical systems, including drone technology. So check out the report. It's due out, and I'll make sure it gets circulated to this group. We'll be out in about a month or so. So what's the bottom line? We want cyber resilience. And thinking about safety tech, you know, we want our organizations to be robust, resilient, safe, and secure. Our data, our networks, and our systems. But equally and oppositely, we need the humans who operate and use those systems to be psychologically robust, resilient, safe, and secure. And again, it is the combination of cyber resilience and human resilience that actually will deliver. So let's talk about trust. I have a problem with the word trust. It's just been applied as a label in the cybersecurity sector industry. Well, what does it really mean? You know, we've got a very old piece of technology, about 1 million years in development, and that's the human brain. And our senses were developed over time, for example, to establish trust. But we did so using every sense at our disposal: our eyes, our ears, our touch, our perceptual skills. So I could meet somebody, talk to them, look at eye contact, smell them, all of these things, and then decide, can I trust this person? And then we just took trust and adopted it in cybersecurity. But online is a lean medium. There are very few perceptual cues that we can use to establish whether we can establish trust or not. So I call this the trust paradox. And I argue that the only way that you can establish trust in these lean mediums is zero trust, always verify. And paradoxically, that is what is going to deliver on and build trust. I mean, trust in a human context is a religious, philosophical belief system. Does it really have a place in the hard sciences unless we can always verify? When we're talking about trust, we've got to think about evolutions in insider threats. Attacks don't, as you know, don't always come from outside the organization. And we're seeing an increasing sophistication in terms of insiders. So we're seeing active online recruitment in terms of insider threats. People approaching people on dark nets. Do you work XYZ? You know, have you got credentials? Do you need $50,000 or $100,000? And that's going to drive the numbers. We're seeing the evolution of insider threat as a service. People, anonymized, on darknets, offering their services to say, you know, I can get you into XYZ bank or financial institution or government department. We're also seeing syndication. We used to conceptualize insiders as sort of a lone threat actor. But what we're seeing now is wolf packs, insiders within organizations syndicating and operating together. Very difficult to detect because they can protect each other. So I would argue that insider is no longer an anomaly a la Snowden. It's actually a prototype. And if you think of a whole generation of young, primarily male, disaffected youth, and just depressed, lost in psychological rabbit holes, a hunting ground for conversion to insiders. So if we look at how do we protect the organization from these types of insiders being recruited into the organization, what you see is many companies hiring employees via Zoom or other video platforms around the world, and they deploy psychometrics. Well, psychometrics are scales that have been established, tested, and validated in the real world. And if we fundamentally believe that human behavior can mutate or change online, then you need to be deploying cyber psychometric testing. Know who your employees are in the real world and know who they are online. One of the ways of establishing absolute verification is deploying biometrics. This is an area that I've published in recently with a group of ophthalmic surgeons. And it's a very exciting biometric because it is, okay, I don't want to say almost impossible to hack because that sounds like a challenge. But it is eminently better than fingerprints or face or iris. It's the optic nerve head. Did you ever go for an eye test and you see that image that comes up on the screen? This is the optic nerve head. And the configuration of the blood vessels in the optic nerve head are more unique than your fingerprint. And it's a living, breathing, live biometric. How do you access it? A modified Topcon camera that can sit on your phone or a camera within a HMDU device. And what's really interesting about this, we talk about dual-use technologies. So you can have your optic nerve biometric, and you can have it baselined, and every time you're logging in, and you're in your hybrid identity environment, and you're being verified in that environment, because it's a living, breathing biometric. First of all, it's live, so this is actually a human. And secondly, in terms of dual use, you will be able to detect any changes to your cardiovascular system at the earliest stages in these tiny nerves that you see at the back of your eye. You will be able to pick up on being pre-diabetic or indeed diabetic. Not you, the technology, if you opt in for a parallel health check while you're logging in. So check out the paper and you can have a look at that. I want to touch on the premise of psychological hackbacks. So this is an IARPA project that was launched, which was called Rescind, Reimagining Cybersecurity with Cyberpsychology-Informed Network Defense. And effectively, when you have a cyber attack, you can't retaliate, even where attribution is certain. And because that in itself would be a cybercrime, a hackback. So IARPA had a look at those cognitive biases and heuristics and decision-making in cyber attackers, and then looking at how they could psychologically hack back to disrupt the process. However, I spoke at the Proposers' Day. I think I was the only person at the Proposers' Day that had 2 higher-level degrees in cyberpsychology. And for me, one of the basic flaws in this program was if you take human decision-making and cognitive biases and heuristics that are actually tested and validated in general population, and then you try to apply that to hackers or cyber attackers, hackers don't think the way that other people do. They have their own mindset and shortcuts and heuristics that are not the same as those in general population. So a group of us sort of went away and started thinking about, well, if we were doing this project, how would we do it? And some of the work I had been doing was in the area of forensic psychology. So you have a crime scene, you have a body, you have wound pattern analysis, you've got, did the perpetrator use a knife? Did they use a gun? And then out of that, you can establish the signature and the behavioral profile. And I took that construct and then transposed it to a cybercrime scene. Now, start thinking about the exploit as the weapon of choice. If it's ransomware, ransomware is highly correlated with hostage taking in a real world context. Hostage taking is highly correlated with what's called the dark tetrad, a comorbid matrix of Machiavellian, sadistic, narcissistic, and psychopathic traits. Not somebody you want to date. So these traits effectively mean that arguably the person who deploys ransomware is a functioning psychopath. What does that mean in terms of active cyber defense? It means there's no point in pleading, I'm a hospital, patients are going to die. Psychopaths have no guilt or remorse. So then you need another counter measure or counter strategy. Now, if somebody deployed spyware, creepware, malware, I wouldn't profile them as a psychopath. I would profile them as lying on the paraphilic spectrum. What does that mean? It means, say, exhibitionistic disorder or voyeuristic disorder. So if you're a voyeur or have a propensity towards voyeurism, then this sort of peeping Tom or Jane, just to be politically correct, software might be your go-to, that voyeurism. What does the voyeur fear more than anything? The premise of being spied back on. So effectively, this is a table from the paper we wrote. I'll come back to that in a second. I'm just watching the time here. And if we think about, I'm talking about human on human actors in terms of a person deploying a ransomware attack. Now let's think about agentic aspects of the ransomware attack. And you might ask, well, is it possible to build a psychopathic AI? Well, the answer is yes, it is. MIT actually built this one called Norman after the, you know who. And effectively, Norman was trained on the data training sets of what we in the business call gore porn, extreme violence. So now you might ask, well, how did they empirically test that this AI that they had built was a psychopath? Well, what did they do? They showed it an inkblot. Now you might look at that, hopefully, and think it's a butterfly or a bat. Norman looked at it and described it as roadkill. So we're living in strange times. We're living in an era where the premise of passive defense means that there is no deterrent for these active cyber attacks. And we're going to have to conceptualize other ways of engaging in active cyber defense. And our paper covered this. And what we looked at was achieving effective defensive operations without breaching the legal threshold of cyber offensive operations. And we called the paper So if you're looking for a fun read, check out The Enterprise Strikes Back. We had a great time writing it. So, a couple of quick Q&As. Aren't hybrid identity environments just a technical problem for IT teams? Why bring psychology into it? Identity is not just about servers and protocols, it's about people. AI is everywhere right now. How real is the threat of AI-driven attacks? Is it just hype? Well, it's not hype, it's happening. And finally, if users are the weakest link, does that mean people will always be the problem in cybersecurity? I see heads nodding everywhere. No. People are not the weakest link. They're just the most targeted link. And they are one of our best forms of defense. So, takeaways. AI doesn't just hack machines, it hacks minds. We got to watch out for security fatigue, particularly in the hybrid identity environment. And hybrid identity isn't just technical, it's psychological. So, as Alex said, the show CSI Cyber was inspired by my work. I wrote on 33 episodes of the show. I was in the writer's room. Patricia Arquette actually played me in the show. I never get tired of saying that because just... I'm sorry. If you had it on your bucket list of having an Oscar-winning actor or actress play you, well, I did that. It was fun. You know, a story about the show we did, you know, the show actually inspired so many memes, mostly from the tech sector, of people going, oh my God, they are dumbing down tech to such a level. And effectively, you know, our target audience was, you know, 13-year-olds. You know, that was the level that the show was pitched at in terms of trying to take complex constructs and bring them to a wider population. I'm a scientist. I'm a believer in dissemination, not writing a paper that a couple hundred people are going to read. But the show actually, when we aired the pilot, it reached an audience, I believe, of over 100 million. For me, that's dissemination. It broke the Guinness Book of Records in terms of the reach. Anyway, we had this section in the show where you had a cyber defender and he's looking at code. And he's looking at, and he said, oh, all I've got is green code. I don't know if any of you remember this. And you see green code going up and going down the screen. And then he goes, hey, we got red code, we got malware. Okay, so everybody freaked out about that. And they said, that's not how it happens. And we said, we know. It's a metaphor. For a seasoned operator, it would jump out as if it was lit up in red. Anyway, that didn't stop all the abuse. Primarily directed at me, but I can take it, you know. I said, you know, I'm a behavioral scientist. When you troll me, you just give me data and lots of it. Knock yourselves out. But while all of this was happening, the US cavalry came to our defense in the form of US Army Cyber Command. I believe it was General Conti at the time. And they wrote an article in one of their publications in defense of CSI Cyber and explaining how this was a ghastly term that is used, infotainment, or no, edutainment, sorry, and sort of educational and entertainment at the same time. So I reached out to Colonel Conti and I said, thank you so much. And he said, well, look, you know, one good turn deserves another. Will you come out and do a talk at West Point? I said, absolutely. So that's CSI Cyber. It's still airing in different places. So we had a blast making it. It was probably a decade ahead of its time, but nonetheless, it was an amazing thing to be involved in. Here's a selection of cyberpsychology resources. One of my students put this together if you're interested. And here's some references. Thank you for your time.